Episode 15, guys. Welcome back to Two Nobodies. I'm Rupesh Patel. I'm really glad to be back, and with my special guest this week, who I'm going to introduce to you guys in a second. I did have a couple of comments that people had made back to me about where were some of the episodes, especially if they've been watching on YouTube. We only have right now the guest episodes that are posted. If you want some of the episodes with Kyle and I and some of our ramblings, you could totally listen to those on anywhere where you get your podcasts, so Spotify, Apple Music, and so on. But feel free to listen to those. We've had some fantastic conversations about, the role of our fathers, fatherhood for us, some of our fears, masculinity, leadership, all kinds of things. But as we moved forward to our guests, we definitely want to make sure we showcase the folks who are spending their quality time with us and just give you guys a different way of viewing our show. So with that, I want to bring in our current guest who's on screen right now, Josh Carter. How you doing, Josh?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm doing very well. Yeah, thank you.
Good. So I brought Josh on because Kyle and I have had conversations about masculinity, and we're trying to explore this topic in a variety of means. And I met Josh indirectly through somebody that we both know, and found out that he is a well-known drag performer in Edmonton. And I was like, that's pretty cool, and I got to have him on the show, and I got to learn more about this because I have no idea. And so Josh and I quickly got to talking. So I appreciate that you wanted to come on the show and talk about your drag performing and educate me too, because I feel like I'm going to have like one of these Jimmy Fallon moments. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, where Jimmy Fallon had RuPaul on his show, and he said, he's like, "Oh, you're like a famous drag queen," and he's like, "Drag queen?" and Jimmy Fallon's
didn't know what to do.
No, and he's like, "No, I'm the queen of drag." And so I'm just totally afraid right now, Josh, that I'm going to say something that's just going to offend you or offend other people who are drag performers. I'm just adjusting my mic here.
Let's just put a caveat out there right from the top that this is a safe space. It's an educational opportunity. So, we're allowed to make mistakes, right? It's all about how we choose to move forward as we are exposed to new information. So I'll make slight corrections. I'd love to share information with you as somebody outside of the community, and I look forward to being able to impart, a little bit of what it's like to be in our drag community in Edmonton.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate you creating that space for me to be vulnerable, and appreciate you kind of being vulnerable and expressing yourself here too. So when I asked for your bio, you sent me your link, and I was like really eager to kind of see the website and everything and see pictures of you, because I hadn't seen what your drag performing outfits and your attire and everything looks like.
Right.
And then your stage name though killed me, because I got to find out what's behind that. So and it's Teen Jesus Barbie. So what's behind that name? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty random story. It happened quite suddenly in Vancouver, actually. That's sort of where I started my professional drag career. I was living there in my early 20s. And I used to live in a penthouse in the West End with my best friend, who was a DJ in Vancouver, named Eddie Toonflash. And we were just having a party one night. I had dabbled with drag before. I'd definitely been into gender illusion or gender fluidity. But anyway, one night in particular, we had a party in the penthouse, and I got into this. I mean, we were lit, right? So I was in the mood, and I got into this zone where I was basically doing little impromptu performances throughout the evening. I would come out in an outfit. I had a closet full of amazing costumes because I worked at a vintage clothing store called Bourgeois Angels. and I would come out in an outfit and do a performance, and oftentimes it would lead to a strip tease. And then I would disappear and reemerge in a new outfit. Anyway, this went on for honestly like probably a few hours. And then at one point, my good friend Jason, Eddie Toonflash, just blurted out this name, Teen Jesus Barbie. And it landed and made sense on so many subtle and yet profound levels that it just clicked. It just stuck. And
It was just sound. Like was there like a meaning to that? Or am I like somebody who's not understanding there's some connotation with those words together or something?
There absolutely is, and you'd have to, it takes a slightly altered mindset to fully kind of understand, but it's almost like he was channeling, to be honest, right? So the fact that like the Jesus name in there, it does imply that there is kind of a spiritual component to myself personally and how I view the world and how I connect with life. It's not a super literal, example, but like drag often is about taking the piss out of things and being quite irreverent at times. So it's a bit of both. There's some duality there. It's both like a nod to the spirituality that I, live and embody, but also a bit poking fun at the, rigid sort of construct of religion sometimes.
Yeah.
And I the teen part, I don't know where it comes from. And obviously at this point in my early 40s, I'm like far from a teen. So it's sort of ironic that I continue to call myself that. Some of my drag sisters tease me all the time. And one day we say I'm eventually going to graduate to like grandmother Jesus Barbie. And then Barbie, of course, is just this, iconic
for sure.
Figure. And in my mind really speaks to the costuming, sort of the presentation, the female, again, illusion or impersonation of gender expression. So
I can't imagine there's another Teen Jesus Barbie out there.
No.
No? Okay.
No. There's definitely not. And some of the bigger names, some of the bigger queens I've worked with or met in the past, when they've heard my name, they just like it's very nonsensical and they get a good laugh out of it. Again, you have to be on a certain level, and when you are, it just kind of, the absurdism, it works.
Yeah. Do you remember your first time when you saw a drag performance?
Oh, goodness. That's a really good question.
And did that matter though? Like, was that sort of like, if you saw that, was that sort of your inspiration, or were you kind of like, you knew this is something you were interested in and it didn't really matter whether you saw one or not? Or
No. I definitely had an impactful moment, but I'll be honest, it wasn't a performance per se. Actually, the first really like aha moment that I saw a drag performer, drag queen, it was actually somebody that I went to high school with. So I was about 15 years old, and we were actually going to Rocky Horror Picture Show. You know how they used to do that at Garneau Theater?
Okay.
Yeah, so it was my first time ever going to Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I was 15. And it was actually another person at my school who was there in line in full drag, full guiche, as we say, and they are beautiful. I know them to this day. She's a transgender woman. She's beautiful, stunning, amazing human being. But I saw this human in full drag in front of me, and I mean, I was just awestruck, absolutely blown away by her beauty, her height, her just projection of power, energy, sexuality. It was just incredible. So, I mean, that made a big impact. And then, to be honest, I started going to nightclubs and stuff at about 15. And so I got exposed to a lot of queer culture, a lot of, again, different gender expressions and stuff. And so there were a lot of different influences and factors. And Edmonton has a very unique culture and community in terms of like queer and alternative subculture, because there's so many small pockets of, say, punk or alternative or goth or LGBTQ, drag, all of it, that they sort of all blend together at certain points, especially they did back in the 90s, maybe less so today. But anyway, so many different influences, leading up to me actually beginning to experiment at first, and then, as I said, moving to Vancouver and finding an opportunity to actually do this on a stage in a more professional capacity, I guess.
And so how many years has it been since you've been performing?
20.
20. Okay. And
Yeah.
do you know people who have been doing it like, throughout into like seniorhood and so on? Like, is that a
Oh,
common thing? Yeah.
well, I don't know if common,
Right.
but absolutely, yeah, yeah. There
Yeah.
are queens that I know, some queens that have been performing for. I'm trying to think. Oh my god, I don't want to name names, but
Yeah.
yeah, definitely longer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. And yeah, yeah. There can definitely be some longevity. It's probably not an easy path to
Okay.
stay kind of relevant and on top of it. But I mean, some of the bigger known drag queens sort of in the world, in America, they've been doing this. Like RuPaul, you brought up
Mm,
RuPaul. I mean, she's been, drag queen supermodel of the world since the
mm,
90s. So, we're looking at good 30-year long plus career.
mm.
Yeah.
Do you, so you were talking about, actually, I wanted to go back on something that you said, because you said some of these cultures and subcultures are all kind of blended in. And so I always had this, I always didn't quite understand like what it meant to be queer. And then so like, and because some of these things do seem like they are blended, but I may be misinterpreting that. Am I mistaken by that, or are there pretty clear definitions for what it means to be queer? And
Good question. I mean, it's very personal.
okay.
Uh, queer isn't a word that sits well with everyone in our community, but it
Okay.
is a part of our acronym. It's a part of our rainbow. So that's the Q in
Yeah,
LGBTQ.
yeah, yeah.
I personally identify with queer. I always have, because for me, it's kind of a liminal word. So it's sort of in between. And in my eyes, it really blends a lot of the rest of the rainbow.
Mm,
There's sort of space for a lot of diversity within just that word to
mm-hmm.
me. But no, absolutely. The reason there are so many letters in our acronym is because there are other people that identify very specifically with one or another or multiple. It's really not limited or really, it's not structured in such a way that that anyone should ever be limited by any notion of
Sure,
identity or
sure.
definition, right? That's kind of one of the beauties of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now what happens with the words like drag and drag performer and drag queen? Like, is there? I remember when prior to us talking, I think I might have used. I think I might have used just drag, and you're like, I think it's drag. You said drag performer. Any sort
Mm.
of like distinctions or things that need to be cleared up there, or
Sure. Well, yeah. So you had used the word in plural. You said drags.
oh, okay, okay,
Um, right. So yeah, drag is, I would almost say, well, it's not a noun, it's an adjective and or a verb. So to
okay,
do drag, to
okay,
drag, right? That could be the verb, but it's also an adjective. Anyway, so there are drag queens, as you mentioned. There are drag performers.
yeah,
Other words that have been used are, again, drag illusionist. Um, uh, uh, there are many different styles of drag. Everything from, am I allowed to swear?
yeah. Go for it. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay, cool.
yeah, yeah.
So I mean, one, and actually, this is, again, I'll just reference RuPaul, because she actually, and I'll just use the female um, version of her. When she started, she would refer to her drag as gender fuck, and
Okay.
that's kind of something that that I really like. Anyway, that's just sort of, again, a nod to the irreverence around defining ourselves based on a specific gender or pronoun, or and again, under the sort of the umbrella of queerness, um, just an acknowledgement that, yeah, in a lot of our minds, gender is a fluid and, you know, it's like a performative expression of gender, and so it can go one way or the other. So I mean, gender fuck can be a part of it. There's other kinds of drags. I mean, we have like drag comedians, we have like fishy drag queens. Those are queens that are that we consider very passable, very beautiful. There are drag kings, I think I mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, we have, I mean, really everything under the sun. Raspberry drag, or that's when men, and that's an old expression, I think. I don't know if it's used that much these days, but that's when men perform with full facial hair but still in drag. Gosh, what else? There's really so many incarnations.
And would you say, does it matter whether people get caught up in, because you said it's like part of the rainbow, right? And so does it matter whether people get caught up on the terminology? Like, certainly I'm sure there are some terms that are probably offensive and don't sit well with people, but like, I almost think that sometimes the naming becomes a barrier to actually holding real conversations and to actually engaging with people. Because sometimes there can be an uncomfortness about people maybe not saying the right things, or on the extreme where people will say the right things and it does become offensive. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really complicated. It's really dynamic, and it's such a personal thing. I mean, I think it's really important to honor and respect everybody's kind of boundaries and their need to be identified as they want to be, as they choose to be viewed, as they choose to be labeled or self-identify. So it's important to listen and to, ask people what their preferences are. But you know what I mean? I think once we put that good foot forward of saying, like, what is your preference and how do I respect you? How do I give you the space that you need to reassure you that I value and respect your boundaries? Then I think that opens a door to being able to be a little looser and a little more comfortable in making mistakes and using the wrong pronouns and using, and not necessarily wrong, but being flexible with those pronouns, because, but we sort of have to walk through this path of mutual sort of respect and kind of exploration of boundaries, because historically those have always been sort of trampled on, right? People's rights and boundaries and safety have been violated and persecuted. And so that's why I think, like in so many other social issues, it's important to start with, a healthy, respectful conversation around, what's acceptable and what's appropriate for each individual.
Yeah.
Once people know that you are trying, like, that's the biggest thing, that you care, that you're trying, that you want to be kind, then it's like we can let a lot of things slide. I think it's not that's more of a mainstream message, I think, for the kind of, in particular kind of right-wing conservative world that puts a lot of really definitive labels and judgments on the community and, uses language in a hurtful way. So once we get past that and realize that, like, we're talking to an ally, it's usually a lot more fun and a lot more fluid.
And I mean, those are really good points. And that's sort of the trouble sometimes I have with it. It doesn't really matter whether it's in reference to the LGBTQ community, or it could be someone from a different country, when there's like almost like a purposeful attempt by somebody to name somebody or name a culture in a way that makes them feel comfortable, but is not sort of really making an effort to hear how somebody wants to be, their preferences, right? Like, I always get thrown off by, like, when someone says the country Iran, right? Like when it's Iran, right? Like that's how people would say it, right? And it's the same thing. But when people put their best foot forward and they're really trying and they make slip ups or whatever, I personally, like, for any sort of, if there's any preferences that I have, there's a whole, like you said, a lot more amount of forgiveness and flexibility,
Yeah.
because you just, you want to move forward with that person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, none of us are, none of us know everything. We don't,
No.
we have to be given opportunities to learn about each other in healthy ways, right? So, yeah, I think that uh, it's really important to be, open and curious and also responsive, right? Like, that's another, a big issue, I think, across the board, no matter what, again, social kind of issue we're talking about, is how does one respond to being corrected or
Mm.
being
Mm.
asked to change a behavior or their languaging, right? Is it going to be met with resistance or defensiveness, or is it, or can we just be humble human beings and say like, oh,
Mm.
I had no idea, I did not know, and so now I can do better moving forward.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember sort of the first time you started dressing drag, and then like what's that process look for you now? Like walk me
Oh.
through, like, before a show, like how much time does that take, and like what's the mental preparation? Is there like a pregame meal kind of thing? Like what does all that look like?
Oh man, yeah, that's a good one. That's changed a lot over the years. I mean, when I was in my teens and early 20s, I
Yeah.
could basically slap on like a little bit of eyeshadow and some lip gloss.
Right.
I had naturally really long hair at the time.
Okay.
Uh, I mean, I could put on a dress and basically run out the door and be in drag.
Okay.
That's not at all what we or the kids, I think, would consider drag today. Um, Makeup and hair and costumery um, has evolved so much over the years, but so even my approach, my style, my preparation for drag has changed immensely over the years. My features have changed obviously as I've
Mm.
matured, so it takes more for me to feminize my features if I choose to, though. Like, that's also a personal choice that doesn't
Mm.
have to, that I don't have to always conform to, and I don't always conform to. Really depends what kind of mood I'm in, what kind of event I'm doing, what kind of message I want to convey. So, uh, currently, and unfortunately, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so it's been like a year since I've done any drag. So I'm not even.
What are you doing right now? Like, is there like, obviously you can't, there's no shows, but are there virtual events, or like what
There
does that
are,
look like?
yeah,
Okay.
there are virtual events, and I think, yeah. So the last one I did was for Pride last year in
Okay.
June, and and actually just had a meeting about Pride Festival, or a Pride event that's going to be happening this year that I'll be involved in through Fruit Loop, which is a local nonprofit that I started with some friends about 8 years ago.
Hmm.
And uh, anyway, but anyway, when my friends from Fruit Loop were asking, "Oh, do you want to do work with us for this event?" And I thought, like, do I even do drag anymore? I have no. It's been so long. I don't even know. I don't even know like how I feel about it right now. I mean, so many things, as I'm sure you know, are up in the air
Yeah.
in this current world. But anyway, back to your question. Yeah, it really depends. There's no. What's the ritual? There's definitely a ritual, and it can take anywhere from, I can bang out a decent look in an hour,
Okay.
or I could take 3 hours getting ready. It really kind of
Depends on what you're
depends.
going for, I
Depends what I'm
guess.
going for. It
Yeah.
depends how much time I've got. Like, I've done events where I need to be at a venue at 9 in the morning. So I'll be up at
Mm.
6, starting to get ready. Everything, starting the process from, showering, shaving, yeah, yeah, getting rid of the hair, right, and then just like the slow build of makeup, organizing outfits. There's a whole body involved, like, that you got
Yeah.
to put together. You have to plan your whole. You usually have maybe multiple costume changes, so you need to have all your costume pieces, accessories,
Mm.
different wigs. I mean, a lot can go into it. So yeah, easily a 3 hour process sometimes.
Have you accumulated things over time, or do you like borrow things from other people, or
Yeah,
what?
a bit of both
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I've definitely accumulated. I mean, so many things have have come and gone through these hands. Like I said, I used to work in vintage for years, and so I've had at times like really massive costume collections and stuff, but I've been a little more transient in the last year, and so
Okay.
I've really whittled down my collection. But absolutely, yeah, you have to. You gotta hang on to a few gems, of course. They're just like your easy go-to,
Yeah.
easy show-stopping outfits.
And do you still get nervous or anxious before a show?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, I mean, when I work with younger, newer performers, and they're nervous or talk about nerves, I mean, I've always embraced nervousness as a sign that like it's really that the event or the message again that I'm trying to convey is the meaningful one to me, and that it's meaningful for me to connect with the audience and for me to express what I have to express. So the nervousness just means that I care and that it's
Absolutely.
meaningful. So yeah, it still
I think if you
happens. It's
weren't
good.
anxious at all, like that probably would be an issue, right?
Yeah, possibly, right? A
Yeah.
little bit of low-lying anxiety is, that's okay.
Yeah. What are your keys, would you say, to like when you're like, oh, that was just an awesome performance. I know I hit that one. Like, what are those things, those notes that you feel like you had to kind of hit?
Uh, it's always the audience reaction first
Okay.
and foremost. I think you can. I mean, if you can't hear it, you can feel the energy, the enthusiasm, the like reception of what you're doing. Typically, again, in a pre-COVID world, that would be cheering, applause. We also have something called tipping culture in drag. So
Mm.
our audiences are now it wasn't actually that common a number of years ago. It's a very common thing in the United States, but in Canada, beyond the court system, which I'm getting into some whole
No, go
other
for it.
categories.
That's okay.
Anyway, tipping culture is something that's kind of a little bit newer in sort of like what I'd say sort of like more mainstream local drag, and that's literally just that the audience will come up and give you cash money while you're performing, and so obviously the more people that are impressed by your performance are going to come up
Get
and
more
give
tips.
you
Yeah.
give you a few bucks,
Yeah.
and that's a direct reflection obviously of how you're doing. But there are also those numbers that you just like. It's just like I said, a message or like an inspiration, a commentary on a social or political cause that you feel powerful about. That you're doing that primarily for yourself. It's like, and that feels amazing. So it kind of doesn't matter if the audience is completely dead silent. Like maybe that's the point. There are people that do numbers. Sometimes I've done performances that are a lot more somber, that aren't necessarily about upliftment or high energy
Mm.
dance kind of stuff. There's things that are really kind of dramatic performances that are just satisfying as from a personal point of view, because it was something weighing heavy in my heart. So like,
Do you
yeah.
remember a specific performance? Like maybe there was a message behind something, or there was a certain moment that you're really trying to capture.
Yeah, for
Sometime.
sure. Yeah. I mean, the most obvious or recent one was my performance for the Pride Fruit Loop last June. Um, this was still the beginning of the pandemic, of the lockdown, essentially. We were, as a society, all suffering through the early stages of that. It was also shortly after the, really large demonstrations of Black Lives Matter.
Mm.
There were several big social movements that were just right on the surface. I mean, they've just been accumulating over the
Hmm.
years. And so I did a performance of, oh my goodness, I'm going to blank on the name. It was Four Non Blondes. Am I crazy? What's going on? Anyway, it's a beautiful song. Uh, it's very emotional, and it's very sort of politically inspired. What at least it was for me. So
Yeah.
I was doing a commentary that was about basically all of these movements rolled into one. and there was no audience there because we were filming it in
Right.
a venue where we couldn't have an audience other than my fellow performers that were there, and that was really awesome. But yeah, that was really meaningful. I mean, I walked off stage and actually like fell into one of the cameraman's arms, like, and just had like a really good cry because
Mm.
it was a very emotional message for me.
At
Yeah.
least there was one person there to catch your fall. Was it entirely empty, hey?
No, exactly. No, there was, like I said, the other performers were there, and we were all really supportive of each other, and we made for a great audience. I mean, performers are the best audience because we know what it's like for, that person on stage, and we're like the first people to be screaming and cheering them on, right? Because we know we want to give that energy back to them.
You talked about sisterhood. So this kind of comes to another question I had. Is you talked about sort of sisterhood. Do you find that is there a competition within the drag performing community, or are you guys pretty tight knit? Just tell me what that looks like.
It's a mixed bag.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's not surprising to me. Like I think that with anything, like there's going to
yeah.
be that, but
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah, there is a lot of sisterhood, and that's what I am all about. Like, that's where I put my energy, is the reciprocal, loving, supportive relationships that I have found and made through the drag community. But there is absolutely also a very competitive edge, and that's, I'd like to say, from my perspective anyway, that's a more of a modern development as well, that has kind of
Okay.
it's coincided with things like RuPaul's Drag Race and drag becoming more
Mm,
mainstream and being on television, and that show specifically is a competition, and so it's really like projected a message into our world about drag being about one person being better than another, which, when you break it down, for most of us, like, I'll just use the word local, for most of us kind of local, smaller time performers, it's never been about that. Our gender, our expression, our art essentially is really a personal expression, and it has nothing to do with anybody else, and we're not trying to be better than anybody else, for the most part. That's not to say that there aren't people out there that want to be the best, that want to be better, that want to make
mm,
more dollars, that want to be professional. And kudos to them. That's fine.
mm.
But like, that's not a game that I've ever been interested in playing.
So what do you think? What's your take on RuPaul's Drag Race? Then do you feel like it sounds like there are some sort of maybe negative things, but I'm assuming there's also it's probably generated a ton of awareness about the drag community and
Yeah.
performing and what it takes and to get at that level. Perhaps I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's a huge topic of conversation, and it's very, very dynamic. So, uh, there have been moments where I've absolutely hated it, the show itself, and like
Yeah,
again, the message that it's conveying to the mainstream and to our younger queens or kings who are coming up, and the impression that they're being given about what is required of them or expected of them, or quote unquote normal. Because again, this message of like competitiveness, what it takes to do drag. It's really been skewed by the show. And when you're watching, internationally broadcasted production of like some of the best drag performers in the world, and they're at a level where they have resources and amazing costumes
sure.
and makeup and wigs. Let's face it, when I was 15, 16, 17, and I was experimenting with drag, just as many youth are today, you don't have access to that stuff. And if that was truly a barrier, then you would probably never get into it. And it kind of saddens me that that might be an impression that young people get, that there's an expectation of a certain status that needs to be achieved before you can actually do it properly. And it's not true. It's not about that at all. It's something that, you it starts inside you. It's a craving within your heart and soul before anything else. I think for the most part, I think, in my opinion, drag performers are very unique individuals. It's very special kind of calling that comes from deep within, that that isn't necessarily, kind of like, that isn't necessarily recognized or kind of glorified or celebrated for just how special just having the spark or the inspiration to do it is, compared to the actual final result of what it could look like. So yeah, the television show is just, it's not an honest representation. It's glamorized. It's a big flourishment of a much deeper personal journey,
What was that deeper initial craving for you? Like you said, started at a really early age. What was that? What was that for you?
I mean, in part just growing up, being different, feeling different, knowing on some level, even though it was probably, unconscious for a long time, that I wasn't, didn't fit in. I grew up with 3 older brothers. So it was pretty evident pretty early on.
So no
that,
sisters, just brothers.
Yeah, just brothers,
Okay.
no sisters. Yeah. And I was the youngest. And it was pretty clear that I wasn't like them. I wasn't into the same things. But I didn't know why. I didn't understand why. I had no concept or framework for gender or gender expression, or there was no options either, really. So that was just sort of a feeling that always lingered, right? And then as you grow up with that kind of confusion, and developing over time through puberty and stuff, start to realize that once again you don't necessarily conform to the binary sort of construct of our world, and you really identify with things that are quote unquote feminine, and but you also still realize and or identify still with your physical body, being a male-bodied individual. I'd never experienced any dysmorphia in terms of that, in that sense, like some people do, like transgender folk do. So you've kind of, again, fallen some kind of area along this amazing spectrum of gender and humanity. And sorry, I'm kind of going all over. It's such a vast topic, but just through time, I got to be exposed to different opportunities, I guess. And like I said, I think that's part of the reason why I started going to nightclubs and things at a pretty young age, because it was, sort of the first time I started to find a community and an environment where I could be a little more flexible and fluid in my exploration. I had a safe space all of a sudden where I could wear stuff that I wasn't allowed to wear in the daytime in public places, or around my family. So I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question anymore.
No, I think you gained to those roots. I mean, I was gonna. Yeah. You started talking about your family. And I just wondering sort of what was the support like sort of early on? When did you sort of letting them in into, okay, there's this side of you that you really want to express, and you wanting to get into drag? Like, when did that start happening?
God, way after I actually did it. Way after. I mean, there was a time in my teens when I kind of thought, like, fuck it. I was sort of like, I didn't care what people thought. So when I was in high school, I was starting to experiment with, wearing makeup to school, or wearing my grandmother's old fur coat, or, jewelry. I was, like I said, again, back then, this in the 90s, there was a lot more mixing of subcultures. And so I was a little bit punk one day, a little bit goth another day, a little bit gender fluid. I was trying on different things, seeing how they felt, how it fit. And at that time, I mean, I was doing it very publicly, and, my family was aware, because they could see, but they weren't engaging me in any way that was like, oh, what does this mean to you? How do you feel? What, there was no conversation. It was always just sort of lumped into this category of, oh, you're a freak, you're a weirdo, you want attention. It was like, there was a lot of that.
That was the reaction that you were getting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, for
Okay.
sure. And I went to, I don't know if you're familiar, but like Victoria Composite High School, that's where I went, and it was considered
Okay.
the art school in Edmonton. And so a lot of people that went to Vic were just labeled freaks. Like that was just,
Hmm.
and that was, again, that was just the catch term, freaks, like
Hmm.
how, how novel. But the beauty of that place was that, yeah, I was in a community in my teens of like a lot of kids who were experimenting and exploring and pushing
Hmm.
boundaries for themselves and their families. But we were not necessarily coming from, I wasn't coming from a family that was embracing that at all. And so, I eventually, my path took me out of the city. I moved away when I was, 19. I left, Edmonton. I lived in the Rocky Mountains for a while, and then I ended up hitchhiking to Vancouver and living there for a number of years. And that's where I really started to like flourish and explore
Hmm.
in a much bigger context. And like I said, got into drag sort of more professionally. But my family had no idea.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
What did
yeah.
they think you were doing?
They thought I was living in a different city. They
Just
thought,
some job or something like that,
well, and
or
I did, because I worked other jobs. It wasn't
okay.
a drag. Drag has never paid the bills.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
not at my level. No, no. I mean, when I lived in Vancouver, and as you can imagine, Vancouver is expensive. It still was back then,
Yeah.
even.
Yeah.
And I lived in a penthouse in the West End. So,
Oh,
I was
that's
rolling.
nice.
I was rolling in the dough for a little while, but I
Yeah.
worked 3 jobs.
Okay. Okay.
I worked 3 jobs to do it. But no, they just thought I was working. I shared enough information, but not too much. I never lied about anything, but again, there was no invitation for me to share much more. And so it wasn't until I think I was 23. I'd actually just moved to Montreal, and I was dating someone, a
Okay.
guy, and it was actually the first time, because I'd never really had a serious relationship until then. And then I realized, as I would have my phone conversations on a weekly basis with my parents, my mother, primarily, I was realizing I was leaving out a big portion of my life, because I
Mm.
would I would talk about, what I was up to, but I would be leaving out this, like, 80% of my experience was like with this new person in my life, and I wasn't talking about it at all. And then I thought, okay, now that feels wrong. I
Hmm.
started to
Hmm.
feel like I was lying or holding back. And so I came home for a visit, and finally came out to my parents, and yeah, got a whole weird reaction. It's been a huge, long, long journey of like learning about each other, and opening up, um and yeah, the drag portion. That was really just about coming out as queer.
Sure. Yeah.
Coming out as a drag performer, I'm trying to think if there was a specific moment. I can't put my finger on a specific moment in terms of coming out as drag. I'm sure I talked about it plenty
Sure.
before anything. It was really only, I'm trying to think, maybe 3 years ago that, uh, well, that's not entirely true. A number of years before, one of my siblings had come to a show, one of my brothers. But about 3 years ago, I had my entire family come to a drag show of mine, and but that was the first time. And that was huge. That was a
That
major moment.
for sure.
Yeah. And part of the only reason that was even kind of possible was because, again, I'm trying to remember exactly. It was 3 or 4 years ago, but a good friend of mine, Go Fetch, who's a local performer, she started a drag brunch event at the Yellowhead Brewery downtown. And so brunch, of course, was happening in the morning and the daytime. And so this was like the first time for so many of us that our family members, children included, were allowed to come to our shows, because
Mm.
normally we were like, we were relegated to nighttime events
Mm.
that usually were happening after midnight. Like,
Mm.
that's just part of the culture. And so, drag brunches was a newer thing. And so having our families come, it was really pivotal and hugely like impactful in terms of this new level of connection that we were able to like make with our families, myself personally, to have my entire family, my niece, my nephews, my ex-partner's 90-year-old grandmother came to one of our shows.
Wow.
I got to serenade her. I mean, it was like, yeah, so it's evolved a lot, but it's taken, the 20 years, as I mentioned, that I've been doing this, to get to this place. So
I can't imagine the reaction or feeling that you would have had, and just like what the reaction on their faces were. Like, was it generally a sense of immense pride, happiness, confusion? Well, like, what was that like? That must have
oh
been a mix of
God.
things, or
Oh,
what?
totally. Well, you
Yeah,
asked about like anxiousness or nerves. Like,
yeah, yeah.
let me tell you, there was a little heavy drinking going on that day. Yeah, it was definitely all of that. It was, and on both parts, right? It's like they were nervous, I was nervous. It's like, how is this going to come together? Um, how are we going to respond? But again, you know, my family has not always been informed or in the know in terms of my community, my culture, and uh, so there's been a long learning curve of us sharing bit by bit, but I'm gonna give them huge, a huge shout out in terms of their willingness to learn
Hmm.
over time, right? And so it was, yeah, it was nerve wracking, but it was also, like I said, it was like one of the most pivotal moments of really, like, when you feel that in your body and your nervous system, that like moment of being able to just be yourself, to be truly at ease.
Hmm.
That's like, it's a kind of a feeling that's really hard to describe unless you've sort of felt it, which I know a lot of people have in different respects. But, when you spend a lot of your life hiding and sometimes, being literally afraid for your physical safety, not to mention emotional and
Hmm.
whatnot, then to be able to step into a relationship where that openness and that love is unconditional, then I mean that's I mean, honestly, I'm gonna cry just thinking about it because there's nothing better.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think we all want to feel validated in some respect, but to, like, you just added that other layer, that sort of unconditional love and support that you typically, not all the time, but typically can get from those really close family members. It's just, I've experienced one or two things like that for myself, and it's just, you can't. It's indescribable,
Absolutely.
the joy that it brings you. So
Yeah.
I'm really happy for you that, like,
Mm,
that sort of happened.
totally.
Who
Me
was there?
too.
Somebody who kind of gave you, was a little bit more, I don't know if difficult is the right word, or had a little bit more of a challenge, kind of overcoming something, or maybe still hasn't overcome something, or
Oh, poor guy. I mean, my dad, I guess, and
yeah,
not,
yeah,
yeah, not to like single him out in a bad way, but I mean, that generation. My dad's 75 now.
okay,
He's an ex-Marine. He was in the Vietnam War. He comes from a military family from the United States. You know, major adjustments in terms of like uh, the learning curve that man has been on is, I would have to say, pretty phenomenal. Um, so
don't you just
again,
feel proud of him for doing that though? Even
absolutely, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
definitely. I mean, there are definitely moments where it's like, because again, you don't know any different, right? So in your experience, you always, because I do believe as human beings, we fundamentally deserve to be loved unconditionally
mm,
from the get-go.
mm,
So to have
mm,
to work for it and towards it, there are moments where you feel very conflicted about what's being given and what you feel you need. And so it's been a major process. There's been times where it's really felt lacking. And then there are these aha moments where you remember how much change the other person has been going through and how hard they actually are working to um, to learn and to find that understanding and
mm.
acceptance for you, that you just, I mean, that melts your heart, and you really can understand like just how deep that love goes, that they would continue to open up and and again, love you and be there in your life and support you, despite all the stuff that they still don't get at all.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Did he ever talk to you in, maybe before the age of 15 or throughout your time when he didn't really know about, this 80% of your life that you sort of weren't expressing to them? Did he ever talk to you about what it meant to be a man from his eyes or masculinity in general?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know what? I will give him props as well for that, because he did try a couple of times around sort of sexual orientation. He tried to kind of open some conversations, but and again, I'll give him props, but I was in a very tumultuous place. I wasn't clear on a lot of things, so it's and he definitely didn't know exactly how to approach me in a super constructive way. So even though he tried, we were at a bit of an impasse. It was hard to have a real exchange or a real, we didn't know how to like have that conversation. So, there were definitely many, many moments. I mean, the one person, and I've talked about this to my brother recently and his wife, actually, because they were both there. They weren't married at the time. We were all still teenagers, but my one brother, Michael, and his wife, Jennifer, they were the first ones when I was about 17 at the time. And I guess they would have been in their early 20s, but they actually kind of asked me point blank. They were the first and only ones in my family to like point blank ask me, "Are you gay?" And even though it was a really difficult moment in conversation, and I also at the time I wasn't super clear on like what I was, and I just said, you know what, I don't look at the world in terms of males and females. I kind of like everybody was sort of my response, and they, reminded me that they loved me no matter what. And as, complicated as that was, to this day, I thank them so much for like opening that door and for starting the conversation, because, and now I feel that emotion coming up, but like when you're a kid and your like elders are, you expect them to pave the way for you, right? So it's really important for your elders, whether they're siblings or parents or grandparents or just elders within your community, for them to invite you into a safe space in that role, in that capacity, in that way that they can give you permissions and love and encouragement. Like, as a youth, that's huge. I think that's massive. It's so important to do that for our children and for the younger generations, to make sure that they know that their individual unique expression of life is like welcome. We want to see it. Like, tell us more. So that was really big. That really impacted me in a way that like kind of no one else did as I was developing, until I met people outside of the family that were into it.
Yeah. I was just gonna say while you drink your water there, is that I think sometimes some parents have, I think sometimes where it maybe goes wrong is that parents have sort of dreams for their kids and expectations for their kids, and what that reality might look like, and when that's this with anything, when your reality doesn't meet your expectations, it creates a whole bunch of sort of negative things that happen afterwards, right? And I suspect that your parents and may have had some thoughts about what you ideally would have maybe looked like, and even even with my so my wife is white, and that was a huge thing for my mom and dad, and to have them accept Michelle was huge. And for them, they had like a view of like their son would be marrying somebody who was East Indian, and that took a lot to get over. And it wasn't until I really started to appreciate that, okay, I understood that it was going to be my parents came from India and that's all they knew, and I understood that piece, but I didn't really understand that, okay, they had these dreams and visions of what their son and who they were going to marry, right?
Right.
And when I internalized that, that sort of developed a whole lot more empathy. But I
Yeah.
agree with you. I think that at least with my daughter right now, like we try to, whenever there's a point of a part of us that's ever like, oh, I hope or wish, we're always like, no, 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 let's take that back, right? Like this is her, and let's give her the space and the pathway to and the support for her to just express herself in her full being. So
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
definitely a shift in parenting that I think we're seeing.
Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, in the world in general, right? Like, but absolutely, I think that particular relationship that you're describing between parent and child is it's fundamental, right? It's sort of the foundation of how a human being, it changes how a human being can develop in the world when they know they have that secure attachment, when they have that unconditional love in
Mm-hmm.
their, in their most base kind of reality, which is their family dynamic, their family unit. Then they can approach the world with so much more confidence and self-love and self-esteem that I mean, I think it just, yeah, again, just really, it really bolsters them up in an incredible way. So, yeah, I appreciate that sharing and that, and the commonality in what you were just describing. Um,
Do you feel like you're at a place of security now,
with my family.
just with yourself and with your family? Yeah.
No, still working on it.
Okay. Okay.
In certain respects, right? There's levels, there's layers. Uh, so yeah, in certain respects, and I will say with my family, I do feel that
Yeah.
um, that security. On that though, it's actually, there's been some major shifts in that direction just recently with my family.
Mm.
So it's something that again has still been developing and in deeper kind of layers of how I feel in my body. And then there are other areas that I'm still working on. That's kind of I mean, my perspective is that that's one of the journeys of life that should never end, is a continual uh, sort of exploration towards full, embodiment and um, loving of oneself. And I don't
Mm.
think that, I don't think there's any rush to be fully there until we're ready to leave this experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we come back to the word of masculinity, is there anything that sort of strikes you with that word? Is there does it bring any sort of like negativity around that word, or what are your views on any discussions that people are having around what it means to be masculine?
Well, I think that a lot of the discussions, well, a lot, I would say, I guess they're, obviously some of the more mainstream discussions that are going on are using the terms like toxic masculinity,
Mm.
um, looking at the fragility of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of, there is, yeah, some, fairly negative connotations there. And those are, again, are the maybe more mainstream conversations that are happening. I'd love to know what men are talking about to each other in terms of their masculinity and sort of that side of the coin. But yeah, uh, I do see the prevalence of toxicity and fragility within the male sort of construct. And it does concern me. It does have some serious issues and some serious limitations, and I see it in a lot of men that I know. I mean, again, let's face, like I said, I grew up with three older brothers and a father. We were sort of a male-dominated household. My mother was the only female, and I mean, I often joke that I was her only daughter, but I had a lot of exposure to masculinity, and it it is, it is a little bit tragic that there were these, again, sort of limited beliefs around how one could express themselves, how one could and or should be or not be vulnerable, have
Mm.
feelings, be, impacted by things, how they were, how we're forced to sort of represent ourselves and or behave in this world. Um, yeah, there's a lot of
I,
room for
I,
improvement.
I think what I'm noticing, and I obviously can't speak for everybody out there for by any means, but it's just that I think there's an openness among men to be more vulnerable and to talk about their life experiences in a way that's not just about sort of the physical event that happened, but sort of the emotions attached to something or the feelings or whatnot.
I hope so.
I think that's occurring. I mean, that
Yeah.
was sort of really a big driver for Kyle and I to start this podcast. Was just when we were having conversations over dinner, they often led to places that were very insightful because we were just really expressing ourselves
Mm-hmm.
and we're like, okay, we think more men need to speak like this. But when I was sort of doing the research in starting this podcast, I was noticing that there were a lot of podcasts and men getting together to want to talk about these things. If that's any indication about maybe if things are shifting, one of the areas where I don't know if it's something that's innately a male thing but I think there's a lot of men who feel like they have the sense of wanting to provide, but that doesn't necessarily mean that obviously women don't want to at all. Like there's nothing like that, of course, but I
Mm-hmm.
always find there's something, um, at least with the interviews I've seen with a lot of these different male groups, when they talk about these sort of things, that all of them sort of have this kind of consensus and this feeling of like, there's something like I need to provide, like I need to rise above and provide for whoever, my family or for myself, with a sense of personal responsibility.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of cool. I mean, I think that there's something to really be looked at there and to really unpack, um, because that might be a really innate impulse in the sort of archetype that is masculinity, and there's nothing
Mm,
wrong with that at all. Um, it's more, I think, some of the bigger social and societal pressures or belief systems around what providing looks like. What does that
right.
mean, right? And what it takes to provide, right? And so I think maybe historically there's been a lot of cause for the suppression of emotion, the suppression of
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable communication that needed to be a part of like a man's sacrifice,
Mm,
to because whatever the conditions in which they were able to provide for their families were, you know, less than ideal. Let's face it. I mean, in a lot of maybe potentially working conditions and or like let's talk. I mean, like a little bit about like military or sort of wartime culture.
mm,
There was a lot of like programs and messages that I think forced men, the male identity, to need to dampen their sensitive side so that
mm-hmm.
they could carry forward, right, and do what you're saying, provide. But that was then, and this is a very different time, and it's not the truth. It may have been true for a time for some people in their experience, but for it to have pervaded the sort of collective mindset of male culture, uh, is unfortunate. That's the overarching kind of message that we're not, but I agree with you is what in what you're saying. Like so many things, these conversations are becoming more and more abundant, more and more common, and I'm so grateful that that's the case because this is going to also, again, coming back to like the children, next generation. This is going to open
Mm-hmm.
the door and create safe spaces for the younger generations to look at their experience of their gender. i.e. masculinity, of their masculinity in a healthier way, in a more open, flexible, personal way that, works for them.
There's something I heard recently just to add to this. I was listening to Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama. They have their own podcast. It's called Renegades, and so
Oh,
they
wow.
did a little bit of a talk on masculinity and fatherhood. And I never heard this perspective, but Bruce Springsteen spoke about masculinity completely different to what I just said about like men sort of feeling like maybe they need to provide. For him, it was very much the opposite. It was like the needing to provide and be there for his family was almost like neutering him from being a man and expressing his masculinity. So he needed to get away, which was largely his experience. Like it wasn't about settling down and being a family man and being the dad and being there for his wife and so on. It was him needing to get away and do his own thing and living by himself that really would prevent him from being less of a man, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, I'd never heard of that, because I just always, I guess I just always mainly saw this sense of like men really wanting to the pressures of needing to provide for their family and being there for them. Like that was like the ideal, like that's what you need to do as a man.
Right.
Like that's sort of how I was raised, especially.
Right.
And those are the conversations I've had with other men about this stuff. So to him describe it as like, no, that's actually was a neutering effect on his masculinity was very striking.
Right. Well, I mean, I can totally appreciate that, because I mean, it's almost like, I mean, he was, in his way, and again, very personal journey for everyone, but he was maybe breaking that mold for himself. And he was, saying, I mean, this is just my interpretation, but like, this isn't, I'm not going to be defined in my masculinity in terms of being a provider or a family man. I'm going to actually break out of that and search for my identity as a male-bodied person beyond that role. Right. So, yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the thing of it is, like, with so much of our reality as human beings, is that there, these constructs and these like really defined roles and definitions of what it means to be anything is just like, it's really never been fair. It's never been representative. It's never been inclusive or open enough to really include the dynamism and the beauty of, individuality and the uniqueness that is kind of, the human experience, right? So all of those constructs are, they're okay starting points, but like, we can't let ourselves get pigeonholed by them. We have to, look within and question everything.
I agree. I wonder if some of that though is just like our brain has this natural ability to just make shortcuts because it's just cheap and easy sometimes.
Sure, and safe. Yeah,
and safe. Yeah, for sure. Right. You're right. It's almost primitive, and so maybe that's why people do that. But
yeah,
as with anything, we need to challenge ourselves to kind of go outside those biases and see the actual truth and observe that truth rather than just limit ourselves to those shortcuts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Especially if you want to see change, if you want to experience change. I mean, and I imagine most humans have experienced some kind of shortcoming in their life, or like, just some area of their life where they thought like, well, that's not right. That doesn't feel good. That like we could do better than this. I mean, if you have any drive to challenge those kinds of boundaries in the world, then you got to start opening your mind and also like, being a little bit creative about how you can challenge the status quo. And I mean, even what you and Kyle are doing with this podcast and the conversations you're having behind the scenes, I mean, you're already doing the work, right, for yourself. And now you're taking it with this podcast to another level where you're actually sharing this in a larger context with more people. And like, these kinds of conversations are just, they're so necessary for all of us to, as part of our internal sort of, questioning, and as well, I mean, we have to do this in relationship with other people as well, because we are sort of we are a community oriented beings, right? Like
Absolutely.
we need to bounce ideas off of each other, and be shown different examples of how, how reality can look, and how things could change, and be better for the future, right?
What continues to just like trouble you as you continue to? Well, you're not sure about. That's a really big question, so I'm going to narrow it down a little
Yeah.
bit.
Thank you.
Because I was like, you're going to go in a bunch of places here. But I guess when it comes to specifically around the drag community, what continues to sort of trouble you? What continues to sort of leave you more hopeful?
Um, Trouble. I mean, what immediately leaps to mind is, for me personally, somewhat is in relation to the pandemic world that we're in. So not having a live audience, I mean, that's troubling to me. Not being able to actually engage with people in person, that is troubling to me in a performative capacity.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, and just kind of a throwback to what I was saying earlier about sort of some of the issues around status, and
Competition and
yeah, the competitive
yeah,
nature,
yeah.
the expectations, the high expectations placed on, what drag is supposed to look like. That troubles me, because that's all BS. We need
Mm.
to, the the performance of drag and of gender is one that needs to always be left completely to interpretation by the artist, and there is absolutely no limitation. I mean, that's like the foundation of what drag sort of represents, is like a fuck you to the binary world that is a fallacy, that is like an illusion that we have constructed and impose upon ourselves and each
Mm.
other. And so drag challenges that. And so there has to always be room for, continued challenging of all of those definitions, boundaries, labels, etc. Um, and what excites me is that there's lots of awesome people doing that. There's lots of amazing young performers and old performers who continue to be themselves and to create really beautiful art. And it's amazing to see how things have evolved as well on a creative level in terms of makeup and costuming,
Mm-hmm.
and again, the social commentary, the political commentary that people are continuing to push forward with their art. That is brilliant and exciting. The places, I don't know why, but all of a sudden, like Nas is coming to mind. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this queer
No.
hip hop artist. He just had a video come out that was like super controversial, and like really,
Okay.
what is it? Nas triple X, maybe?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyhow, look into it, because it's beautiful. It's well done. It's provocative. It's controversial, as I said, and but to have representation of a queer person of color in the hip hop world, which is largely
It's huge.
dominated by
Huge.
cis hetero men, that is massive. Exactly. So to see that kind of stuff, that super excites me. To see, more and more representation across the board is,
Mm-hmm.
um, I mean, I can't, like, that makes me emotional. That's like, you can't get better than than celebrating and uplifting the people that are really fighting to like make this world a safe
Mm-hmm.
place for everyone to just be authentic in, and yeah, to be met with that unconditional love that we all deserve from the get-go. But again, we've got to work hard to continue to create those safe spaces for each other, and welcome in all of that uniquity and beauty that that we are, and that is like, really the spice of life, right?
I love that. I'm not gonna belabor our conversation because this was such a beautiful way to sort of end the conversation here. I do want to do actually to get you a little bit better. I always ask these sort of final two questions.
Okay.
Dead or alive, who are 5 people that you would want to have a meal with? I mean, they can be collectively or individually.
Okay.
So who would those 5 people be?
Woo, that's fun. My first one would be my favorite singer-songwriter of all time. If I could listen to one and only one musician for the rest of my life, it would be Nina Simone. So absolutely Nina would be one. Again, there was no accident when my friend channeled my drag name. So I'm going to say Jesus is another one. I would love to pick that human's brain. Let's see. Who else? You know what? Another controversial character, but honestly was my childhood hero because of when my dad told me stories about him growing up. Even though I recently found out that was not my dad's intention, was to like paint him in a great light. But he became my childhood hero. It was Rasputin. Yeah, so I'd love to meet him and get his version of the story. The truth.
That's a good one.
Who else? Oh my goodness. Martha Johnson was a trans activist. There at like the Stonewall riots in the 60s that kicked off the revolution. I would love to meet and converse with Martha P. Johnson. That would be amazing.
Is she American?
She was American, yes. Yeah, an African American trans woman. And yeah, and then lastly, I'm going to say, and it's just the very vague, it'll sound vague, but to me it means something, and it's more specific. I couldn't go into too much detail, but it would be one of my ancestors from several generations ago. And one in particular that I would love to, talk about some of my lineage. Yeah.
Besides the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
What comes to mind is that what I know for sure is that love is really the highest vibration, and it's what we are all yearning to return to.
Totally. Yeah, I think we're all yearning for a ton of that right now. Absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt.
Josh, this was actually I really enjoyed this conversation. Aww. I'm really happy to have had you as a guest. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for having me.
There's so much, absolutely. There's so much I learned, not only about your art form, but about you as a human being, and you're just just a beautiful person. And so thank you so much for joining us. If people want to reach out to Josh, I'll put some information in our show notes, and a link to their website and his Instagram and all that great stuff. And you can check out his videos on YouTube. I was actually doing a lot of watching this week, Josh.
No.
Yeah, I was watching some of your performances. I had to do my research, right? It was fun to watch. So,
okay.
By the way, I got to say, my YouTube algorithm is like totally getting messed up these days because like we've had so many random conversations, Kyle and I, and so as we're doing research, like my YouTube algorithm is probably like, what do you want? Because like now you're into like drag, like what's going on?
Totally, that's amazing.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.
I look forward to talking to you in the future, and all the best.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much, Rupesh. That was amazing. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you being open and inviting me in.
For sure. Mm-hmm. Okay, take care.
Okay, you too. Have a great day.
Okay, you too. Bye.